The carriage rattled over the uneven cobblestone road, each jolt sending tremors through Edward's exhausted body. He clutched his travel bag tightly, the last possession he truly owned, as the dark forest loomed around him. The village he'd passed through had been filled with murmurs, hushed warnings, and fearful glances as soon as he mentioned his destination. The cursed manor, one old woman had whispered. Her wrinkled hands trembled as she gripped her shawl. No one goes there unless they've got no choice. Not unless they are ready to serve the beast. Edward, though polite, had ignored the superstitions. He'd heard worse in his years of service. Ghosts, curses, monsters. He'd learned that most tales of horror were little more than exaggerated stories meant to keep the curious away. What mattered to Edward was that he needed the work. The letter of employment had promised generous pay and room and board, and he could not afford to be picky. The forest seemed endless, its gnarled trees twisting into one another like skeletal fingers. When the carriage finally broke through into a clearing, Edward's breath caught. The manor loomed ahead, its towering spires silhouetted against the dusky sky. Dark ivy climbed the stone walls, and the windows seemed to glimmer with a faint, otherworldly light. It was grand, imposing, and utterly unlike anything Edward had seen before. The driver stopped abruptly and cleared his throat. "This is as far as I'll go, sir." He didn't meet Edward's eyes as he helped him down and handed him his bag. "The manor's up the path. Good luck to you." Edward offered a polite thank you, though the man had already turned his carriage around and hurried back down the road. Alone now, Edward took a deep breath and started up the winding path. Gravel crunched beneath his boots, and the air grew colder with each step. At the massive wooden door, Edward raised the heavy knocker shaped like a snarling beast. It felt fitting, though he brushed aside the nervous thought and rapped 3 times. The sound echoed ominously. The door creaked open, and Edward was met with nothing. The entryway was dimly lit, and no one stood to greet him. Frowning, he stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Hello," he called, his voice steady but firm. A sudden clang echoed from the far end of the grand hall. Edward turned to see a tall figure step into the light. His breath caught as he took in the sight of Lord Alaric. The man, or creature, as Edward couldn't decide, was unlike anyone he'd ever seen. Alaric stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders and... Edward stiffened as the towering figure stepped into the dim light of the grand hall. Lord Alaric was an intimidating sight to behold, his features sharp and animalistic, like a predator frozen between man and beast. His eyes, a piercing gold, locked onto Edward with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Thick scars carved down the left side of his face, disappearing into the high collar of his dark coat. His clawed hands gripped a heavy cane, though the way he carried himself suggested he didn't need it. "You're late," Alaric growled, his deep voice reverberating through the empty hall like a low roll of thunder. Edward adjusted his stance and bowed, keeping his expression neutral despite the chill that ran down his spine. "My apologies, my lord. The journey was longer than anticipated." Alaric's gaze raked over him, unflinching, as though he were weighing Edward's worth in a single glance. "I hired you to serve, not to make excuses." "Yes, my lord," Edward replied evenly, refusing to show any sign of fear. His calm demeanor was one of his greatest skills, and he wasn't about to let this strange employer unsettle him. Alaric grunted, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if Edward's composure irritated him. "Follow me," he barked, turning sharply and striding down the hall, his heavy boots echoing against the marble floor. Edward followed, his polished shoes clicking softly behind the beast's thunderous steps. The interior of the mansion was breathtaking despite its eerie atmosphere. Chandeliers hung high above, their crystals reflecting the dim light of flickering candles. Massive tapestries lined the walls, depicting scenes of battles, royal feasts, and a once beautiful garden that now seemed overgrown and forgotten outside the windows. They stopped at a smaller room off the main corridor, a study, it seemed, with tall shelves overflowing with books and a large desk cluttered with papers and maps. Alaric gestured toward a smaller desk near the window. "That will be your station when you're not attending to other duties," he said brusquely. "My station?" Edward asked, his tone polite but curious. Alaric turned to him, his golden eyes narrowing. You are my butler, do you not? You will organize my affairs, maintain the household, and ensure everything runs as it should. Do you require a more detailed explanation? No, my lord, Edward replied, meeting Alaric's piercing gaze. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, and Edward swore he saw something flicker in Alaric's eyes, something beyond anger or disdain. Sadness, perhaps? Loneliness? Whatever it was gone in an instant as Alaric's expression hardened once more. You may begin tomorrow, Alaric said curtly, turning away and walking toward the far side of the room. He paused by the fireplace, his clawed hand gripping the mantel as if steadying himself. Without looking back, he added, "Stay out of the West Wing. That is not part of your duties." Edward's curiosity flared, but he kept his face neutral. "As you wish, my lord." The following morning, Edward began his work in earnest. The mansion was a labyrinth of forgotten beauty and quiet shadows, with every room holding secrets in its walls. He discovered small details that spoke of a life once full of light, a cracked vase filled with dried flowers, a piano covered in a fine layer of dust, and faded paintings of a man who looked remarkably like Lord Alaric, but human and smiling. As the days passed, Edward noticed a pattern in Alaric's behavior. The master of the house was always watching but never engaging. He lingered in doorways when Edward worked, his golden eyes following every movement with an intensity that was both unsettling and intriguing. Edward, in turn, found himself drawn to the strange man-beast in ways he didn't understand. One evening, Edward entered the dining hall to set the table, only to find Alaric already there, seated at the head of the long, empty table. A single candelabra cast a warm glow over the room, illuminating the deep lines of his face and the sharp curve of his jaw. "You work tirelessly," Alaric said without looking up. His voice was softer than usual, almost contemplative. "It is my duty," Edward replied, carefully arranging the silverware. "And is duty all you care for?" Alaric's tone was sharper now, though there was no anger behind it, only curiosity. Edward paused, his hand lingering on a wine glass. "Duty provides structure, my lord. It keeps the mind from wandering to unpleasant places." Alaric's gaze flicked to him, and for the first time, Edward saw something raw in his expression, something unguarded. "I see," was all he said. As Edward turned to leave, Alaric spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you believe the stories they tell about me? That I am a monster?" Edward hesitated, then turned back to face him. "I believe that we are more than the stories told about us." Alaric looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for a moment, the mask of the beast slipped. There was pain in his eyes, yes, but also something else. Hope. That night, Edward lay awake in his modest room, staring at the ceiling. The memory of Alaric's gaze lingered in his mind, making his chest tighten in a way he didn't fully understand. The man was enigmatic, tormented, and utterly unlike anyone he'd ever known. And yet, against all logic, Edward felt the first stirrings of something dangerous, something that could shatter the careful walls he'd built around his heart. The following days settled into a strange rhythm. Edward learned the routines of the mansion quickly, but the house itself seemed to resist his efforts. No matter how thoroughly he cleaned, cobwebs would creep back into corners, and the air always carried a faint chill. The mansion seemed alive in its own way, its creaks and whispers unsettling yet oddly comforting, as if it were speaking to those who paid attention. Edward rarely saw Lord Alaric during the day. When they did cross paths, it was often in silence, with Alaric offering only curt nods or brief instructions. Yet Edward could feel his presence everywhere, as though the master of the house was watching him from the shadows, always observing but never intervening. One afternoon, Edward was polishing the banisters in the grand hall when he heard a soft voice behind him. "You're doing a fine job, you know." Startled, Edward turned to see no one there. His hand froze mid-polish as he scanned the room, his heart pounding. "Down here," the voice called again, and this time Edward's eyes dropped to the source. The banister he'd been cleaning, more precisely, the ornate brass ornament shaped like a lion's head, blinked. Edward stumbled back, nearly dropping his cloth. "What in the world?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," the lion ornament said, its voice gruff but oddly kind. "You're in the beast's house. Did you think you'd get away without a little magic? Edward stared, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. I suppose I didn't think it through. The lion chuckled, a deep, metallic sound. You're handling it better than most, at least. The last one ran screaming into the forest before he even made it to dinner. Edward straightened, brushing the dust off his jacket and willing his composure to return. Well, I've seen worse than a talking piece of furniture. Though I must admit, this is a first. Good lad, the lion said approvingly. Name's Gregory, by the way. And before you ask, yes, I used to be human. Most of us here did. Edward frowned, glancing around the hall. Most of you? Before Gregory could answer, the grandfather clock in the corner chimed loudly, and Edward swore it let out a sigh of relief once the sound faded. Yes, most of us, Gregory replied. The staff, the house, it's all tied to the curse. We're as much prisoners as Alaric is. Edward's curiosity flared, but Gregory seemed to anticipate his next question. Don't bother asking for the details. It's not my story to tell. But I will say this, Gregory's voice grew softer, almost wistful. He wasn't always like this. There was a time when this place was full of life, laughter, and light. The curse didn't just take his body. It took everything. Edward felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, pity, perhaps, or understanding. Is there a way to break it? Gregory hesitated. There's always a way, isn't there? But whether it'll happen, he trailed off, his brass eyes narrowing slightly. That depends on him. And maybe, on you. Before Edward could respond, the creak of heavy footsteps echoed from above. Gregory's face froze into its usual inanimate expression, and Edward turned to see Lord Alaric descending the grand staircase. Alaric's sharp gaze swept over Edward before landing briefly on the polished banister. You've been busy, he remarked, his tone neutral. Only doing my duty, my lord, Edward replied with a slight bow. Alaric's lips twitched into something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Good. Without another word, he strode past, his coat billowing behind him. Edward watched him go, his mind racing. The more time he spent in this house, the more he realized how deeply the curse had sunk its claws into everything, and how much it weighed on Alaric. The man carried his torment like a second skin, his every movement a reminder of the pain he bore. Later that evening, as Edward prepared to retire for the night, he found himself lingering by the grand piano in the parlor. Its keys were dusty, untouched for years, but he could still imagine the music that must have once filled the room. Do you play? Edward turned to see Alaric standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I used to, Edward admitted. My mother insisted on lessons when I was a child, though I was never very good. Alaric stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the piano. Play something. Edward hesitated. I doubt it will sound as it should. It's been years. Play, Alaric repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. With a nod, Edward seated himself at the piano and pressed a few tentative keys. The sound was slightly off, but not unpleasant. Slowly, he began to play a simple melody, one his mother had taught him when he was young. The notes filled the room, soft and melancholic, echoing through the vast emptiness of the mansion. When he finished, Edward looked up to find Alaric watching him intently. For a moment, the beast's hard exterior seemed to crack, revealing a flicker of something vulnerable. Why did you stop? Alaric asked, his voice quieter now. Edward hesitated, his fingers lingering on the keys. Life has a way of stealing things from you, he said finally. Music was one of the first to go. Alaric nodded, his gaze distant. Life does that. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. For the first time, Edward felt that he was seeing the man beneath the curse, a man who had lost as much as he had gained in his lifetime, and who carried those losses like chains. Without thinking, Edward spoke again. Perhaps some things can be reclaimed. Alaric's eyes met his, and in that moment, Edward thought he saw a spark of hope. It was faint, fleeting, but it was there. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Edward vowed to nurture it. Edward awoke the next morning with a sense of unease and resolve twisting in his chest. His conversation with Lord Alaric the previous night had stayed with him, lingering like the remnants of a half-remembered dream. There was a pain in Alaric's voice that resonated deeply, a pain that Edward recognized all too well. After finishing his morning tasks, Edward found himself wandering toward the west wing, the forbidden part of the mansion. He hadn't planned it, not consciously, but his curiosity had been gnawing at him. What secrets did Alaric keep hidden behind those darkened halls? And what role did they play in the curse that bound him? The air grew colder as Edward moved farther into the west wing. The once grand corridors were darker here, the windows covered by thick curtains that let in no light. Dust coated every surface, and the faint scent of decay hung in the air. As he rounded a corner, Edward came to a massive wooden door, its surface engraved with intricate designs of vines and beasts. His hand hovered over the handle, hesitating. He could hear faint whispers beyond the door, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to beckon him closer. "What are you doing here?" Edward spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Alaric stood at the end of the corridor, his golden eyes blazing with anger. I didn't mean to intrude," Edward stammered, stepping back from the door. Alaric closed the distance between them in a few long strides, his presence looming. "I told you to stay out of the west wing. I was only—" "Curiosity is dangerous in this house," Alaric interrupted, his voice a low growl. His clawed hand shot out, gripping Edward's wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to hold him in place. "You do not understand what you're dealing with." Edward met Alaric's gaze, his own resolve hardening despite the fear coursing through him. "Then help me understand." For a moment, the anger in Alaric's eyes faltered, replaced by something raw and unguarded. He released Edward's wrist and turned away, his broad shoulders tense. "This house is a graveyard of memories," Alaric said quietly, his voice heavy with bitterness. "There is nothing here for you but pain." Edward took a step closer, his voice soft but steady. "And yet you remain." Alaric's jaw tightened, his claws flexing at his sides. "Because I have no choice." Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. Edward wanted to press further, to unravel the layers of torment that Alaric kept hidden, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, he said, "You're not alone in this, my lord. Whether you believe it or not, I am here to help." Alaric turned to him then, his golden eyes searching Edward's face for something, what, Edward couldn't say. But whatever it was, it seemed to shake Alaric to his core. "You're a fool," Alaric said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps," Edward replied with a faint smile. "But I'd rather be a fool than a coward." For the first time, Alaric let out a soft laugh, a sound so unexpected that it sent a shiver down Edward's spine. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," Alaric muttered, shaking his head. "Then show me," Edward said. Alaric's gaze lingered on him for a long moment before he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the corridor. Edward watched him go, a strange mix of frustration and admiration blooming in his chest. That evening, Edward found himself in the library, lost in thought. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the rows of bookshelves. He was scanning the titles when he heard the door creak open behind him. "Edward." He turned to see Alaric standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "My lord," Edward said, inclining his head. "I've been thinking about what you said," Alaric began, his voice hesitant. "About not being alone." Edward set down the book he'd been holding, his full attention on Alaric. "And?" Alaric stepped into the room, his movements slower, less guarded than usual. "If you truly wish to help, then I will give you the chance. But know this, the truths you seek may change how you see me. And once you've seen them, there is no turning back." Edward nodded, his heart pounding. "I understand." Alaric studied him for a moment before gesturing toward the fire. "Sit. There's something you need to know." Edward obeyed, taking a seat in one of the armchairs near the hearth. Alaric remained standing, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "This curse," Alaric began, his voice low and steady, "was not placed upon me by chance. It was punishment, retribution for a choice I made long ago. Edward's brow furrowed. What choice? Alaric's golden eyes met his, and for the first time, Edward saw true vulnerability in them. I betrayed someone I loved. The words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Edward waited, sensing there was more to the story. He was everything to me, Alaric continued, his voice breaking slightly. But I was a coward. I chose power over love, and in doing so, I condemned us both. Edward's chest tightened at the raw emotion in Alaric's voice. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he knew better than to interrupt. The curse was his final act of vengeance, Alaric said bitterly. To make me the monster I had already become in his eyes. Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice soft but firm. You're not that man anymore. Alaric let out a bitter laugh. You know nothing about me. I know enough, Edward countered. I know that you regret what you did. I know that you've carried that regret every day since. And I know that the man standing before me now is not a monster, no matter what you believe. Alaric's eyes softened, and for a moment, Edward thought he saw a flicker of hope. You are too kind, Alaric murmured. And too foolish. Perhaps, Edward said with a small smile. But I meant what I said. You're not alone in this, my lord. Alaric didn't respond, but the way his gaze lingered on Edward spoke volumes. That night, as Edward lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Alaric's confession. The man was haunted by his past, trapped in a prison of his own making. And yet, Edward couldn't help but feel drawn to him, not just out of pity, but out of something deeper. It was dangerous, he knew. But the heart rarely heeds logic.
The mansion seemed quieter the next morning, as if it, too, was holding its breath after Alaric's confession. Edward went about his duties, his thoughts consumed by the weight of Alaric's story. He had glimpsed the cracks in the beast's armor, the humanity that still lingered beneath the curse. And yet, the full truth felt like an iceberg. Alaric had only revealed its tip, and Edward was determined to uncover the rest. It wasn't long before the house seemed to sense Edward's intentions. Whispers followed him as he walked through the halls, and objects he hadn't noticed before seemed to watch him. Gregory, the talking lion ornament, warned him as he polished the banisters. You're poking at things best left alone, Gregory said, his voice a low rumble. The West Wing, his past, they are wounds that haven't healed, lad. You'll only stir trouble. I can't help him if I don't understand him, Edward replied, his hand pausing mid-polish. Whatever happened to him, it's part of the curse. If I want to break it, I need to know. Gregory sighed, the sound metallic and weary. You've got a good heart, Edward. But a man's scars aren't always yours to mend. Edward frowned, but before he could respond, a loud crash echoed from the dining hall. Startled, he rushed toward the noise, Gregory's warning still fresh in his mind. When Edward arrived, he found Alaric standing amid shattered glass and splintered wood. The remains of a broken table littered the floor, and Alaric's claws were curled into fists at his sides. His breathing was heavy, his golden eyes blazing with anger, or perhaps something deeper. My lord? Edward asked cautiously, stepping into the room. Alaric turned sharply, his expression dark. What are you doing here? I heard the noise, Edward said, keeping his voice steady. Are you hurt? Alaric let out a bitter laugh, gesturing to the destruction around him. Do I look hurt? Or do I simply look like the monster I am? Edward took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. You look like a man who's hurting. Alaric froze, his claws flexing at his sides. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, but instead, he turned away, his shoulders slumping. You should leave, Alaric said, his voice low. Before you regret staying here. I'm not leaving, Edward replied firmly. Alaric's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing. Why? Why are you so insistent on helping me? On staying in a place where you don't belong? Edward hesitated, searching for the right words. Because I see you, Alaric. Not the curse, not the beast, but the man beneath it. and I refuse to believe that man is beyond saving. Alaric's gaze softened, and for a moment the anger in his eyes flickered into something else, something vulnerable. You don't understand what you're saying, he murmured. Then make me understand, Edward said, stepping closer. Show me what you're so afraid of. Alaric stared at him, his expression conflicted. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh and gestured toward the door. Follow me. Alaric led Edward through the mansion, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They passed through the west wing, the air growing colder with each step. Edward shivered but pressed on, his resolve outweighing his fear. Finally, they came to a small, hidden chamber at the end of the hall. The room was dimly lit, with a single window casting pale light over a collection of objects, faded portraits, tarnished jewelry, and a large mirror covered by a black cloth. This, Alaric said, his voice tight, is all that remains of my past. Edward stepped into the room, his eyes drawn to the portraits on the wall. One depicted a younger Alaric, his features sharp and regal, his eyes filled with a light that no longer existed. Beside him stood another man, his expression soft and warm, his hand resting on Alaric's shoulder. Is this him? Edward asked quietly, gesturing to the man in the portrait. Alaric nodded, his gaze fixed on the painting. His name was Arian. He was everything to me. Edward felt a pang of sorrow as he looked at the portrait. What happened to him? Alaric's jaw tightened, his claws flexing. I betrayed him. I let my ambition blind me, and by the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. He cursed me with his dying breath, binding me to this form and to this house. Edward's chest ached at the pain in Alaric's voice. Do you still love him? Alaric's eyes met his, and for the first time, Edward saw tears glistening in them. I will always love him. But that love is my punishment. It keeps me chained to what I've lost, to what I can never undo. Edward stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. Love isn't a punishment, Alaric. It's a gift. And while you can't change the past, you can choose what to do with the future. Alaric shook his head, his expression bitter. You don't understand. The curse can't be broken. Not by love, not by hope. It's eternal. Then we'll find another way, Edward said, his voice filled with determination. Alaric stared at him, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he reached for the black cloth covering the mirror and pulled it away. The mirror surface shimmered, revealing an image of Edward standing beside Alaric. But the reflection was different, the beastly features were gone, replaced by a man with sharp, handsome features and golden eyes filled with warmth. This is who I was, Alaric said, his voice heavy with regret. And who I will never be again. Edward stepped closer to the mirror, his reflection merging with Alaric's. I don't believe that, he said softly. I see the man you were every time I look at you. And I won't stop fighting until you see him, too. Alaric's eyes softened, and for a moment, Edward thought he saw a flicker of hope. You're a fool, Alaric murmured. Perhaps, Edward replied with a small smile. But I'd rather be a fool than give up on you. The days that followed brought a fragile, unspoken shift between Alaric and Edward. The barrier that had once separated them, of secrets, anger, and pain, began to thaw, revealing glimpses of something more profound. Alaric, despite his self-imposed isolation, started lingering in the rooms Edward worked in. He would sit in the shadows of the library, pretending to read as Edward dusted the bookshelves, or silently observe Edward as he tended to the garden. It wasn't much, but it was something, and Edward took solace in those small moments of proximity. Edward, in turn, found himself growing bolder. He began speaking to Alaric as though they were equals, weaving light-hearted remarks into their conversations to coax a smile or a laugh. Sometimes, he succeeded. Other times, Alaric's guarded demeanor returned, but even then, Edward refused to retreat. It was during one such moment, while Edward was repairing a broken clock in the study, that Alaric finally spoke of something that piqued Edward's curiosity. You remind me of him, Alaric said, his voice low and distant. Edward paused, his hand stilling over the clockwork. Of Arian? Alaric nodded, his golden eyes fixed on the flickering fire. He had a similar stubbornness and unwillingness to give up. It was both his greatest strength and his greatest flaw. "Sounds like a remarkable man," Edward said softly. "He was," Alaric replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "He saw the good in everyone, even in me. He believed I could be better than the man I was." "And could you?" Edward asked, his voice gentle. Alaric's smile faded, his gaze growing somber. "I wanted to. For him, I would have moved mountains. But in the end, my pride outweighed my love. And that is a sin I can never atone for." Edward set down the clock and turned to face Alaric fully. "I don't believe that. Redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about choosing to be better now. And you've already taken that first step, whether you realize it or not." Alaric's eyes searched Edward's face, his expression conflicted. "You speak as though you know me." "I do," Edward said simply. "Because I've taken the time to see you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Alaric looked as though he might respond, but then he stood abruptly, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Edward. "You shouldn't waste your compassion on me, Edward," Alaric said, his voice rough. "It will only end in heartbreak." With that, he left the room, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts and the faint ache in his chest. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, staring up at the canopy above him, his mind racing with thoughts of Alaric. The man was a puzzle, each piece more intricate than the last, and Edward was determined to put them all together. But it wasn't just curiosity driving him, it was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years. He was drawn to Alaric in a way he couldn't explain, a way that defied logic and reason. And as much as he tried to deny it, the truth was becoming harder to ignore. He cared for Alaric. Deeply. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. Alaric was bound by a curse, a past riddled with pain and regret. And yet, Edward couldn't help but hope that he might be the one to break through the darkness and show Alaric that he was worthy of love. The next morning, Edward decided to take a risk. He prepared breakfast as usual but added something extra, a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from the garden, tied together with a simple ribbon. When Alaric entered the dining hall, his expression shifted to one of surprise. He eyed the bouquet suspiciously before glancing at Edward. "What is this?" Alaric asked, his tone gruff. "A gesture," Edward replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "Flowers symbolize hope, my lord. I thought you could use some." Alaric stared at the bouquet, his golden eyes unreadable. For a moment, Edward feared he'd made a mistake. But then Alaric reached out, his claws carefully brushing against the petals. "They're beautiful," Alaric said quietly, his voice tinged with wonder. Edward's heart swelled at the rare vulnerability in Alaric's tone. "I'm glad you think so." Alaric placed the bouquet on the table, his gaze lingering on it for a moment before turning back to Edward. "Why do you continue to do this? To show kindness to someone who doesn't deserve it?" "Because I believe you do deserve it," Edward said, his voice steady. "And because kindness is never wasted." Alaric shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're insufferable." "Perhaps," Edward replied with a grin. "But I like to think it's part of my charm." To Edward's surprise, Alaric let out a soft chuckle, a sound so rare that it sent warmth flooding through Edward's chest. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Alaric and Edward continued to deepen. They spent more time together, sharing stories, laughter, and moments of quiet companionship. And though the mansion still held its shadows, Edward began to see a light emerging within Alaric, a light that had been buried for far too long. But as the light grew, so did the whispers in the halls. The curse was not pleased with Edward's influence, and it would not relinquish its hold on Alaric without a fight. The days after the moonlit dance marked an undeniable change between Alaric and Edward. The mansion itself seemed to reflect this shift, the oppressive atmosphere lightened, and the once constant creaks and whispers quieted. It was as though the curse had been momentarily subdued, retreating into the shadows. Edward noticed Alaric's demeanor softening. While the beast still bore the weight of centuries of regret, there was a new light in his golden eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. One afternoon, Edward was tending to the garden. He'd made it his personal mission to bring life back to the overgrown and neglected plants, believing that beauty could be restored even in the darkest places. He was humming softly to himself when Alaric appeared, his massive frame surprisingly quiet as he approached. "You've taken to this place like it's always been your home," Alaric remarked, leaning against a nearby tree. Edward looked up, brushing dirt off his hands. "I suppose I have. It's easier to care for something when you believe it can grow again." Alaric tilted his head, his golden eyes studying Edward intently. "And do you believe I can grow again?" Edward straightened, meeting Alaric's gaze without hesitation. "Yes, I do." Alaric seemed taken aback by the certainty in Edward's voice. He looked away, his claws lightly grazing the bark of the tree. "You're an odd man, Edward." "Perhaps," Edward replied with a small smile. "But oddness has its charm." Alaric chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "Indeed, it does." That evening, Edward found himself drawn to the library, a place he had come to cherish. The vast collection of books offered both escape and insight, and he often lost himself in their pages for hours. As he browsed the shelves, his fingers brushing against the worn spines, he came across a leather-bound journal tucked away in the corner. Its cover was plain, unmarked by any title or design. Curiosity piqued, he opened it and discovered neat handwriting scrawled across the yellowed pages. It was a diary, and as Edward skimmed through the entries, he realized it belonged to Alaric. The entries were fragmented, detailing moments of joy, sorrow, and regret. One passage, in particular, caught Edward's attention. "Arian believed in me when no one else did. He saw something good in me, something worth saving. And yet, I failed him. I failed us. If there is redemption to be found, it will come too late. I am beyond saving." Edward's heart ached as he read the words, the pain behind them palpable. He carefully closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf. He didn't want to pry into Alaric's past without permission, but the entry reaffirmed what he already knew. Alaric was a man burdened by guilt and in desperate need of forgiveness, even if he couldn't see it himself. Later that night, Edward found Alaric in the drawing room, staring out the window at the starlit sky. The beast looked almost peaceful, his sharp features softened by the gentle glow of moonlight. "I found your journal," Edward said softly, stepping into the room. Alaric turned, his expression unreadable. "Did you read it?" "Only a little," Edward admitted. "I didn't want to invade your privacy, but I wanted to understand you better." Alaric sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "There's not much to understand. I was a fool who let pride and anger destroy everything I loved." "That's not true," Edward said, his voice firm. He crossed the room and stood in front of Alaric, his gaze unwavering. "You've suffered, yes, but you've also grown. The man you are now is not the same as the man who made those mistakes." Alaric looked at him, his golden eyes searching. "Why do you care so much, Edward? Why do you insist on seeing something in me that no one else does?" Edward hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he took a deep breath and said, "Because I've come to care for you, Alaric. And I refuse to believe that you're beyond saving." Alaric stared at him, stunned into silence. For a moment, Edward feared he had overstepped, that his confession would drive Alaric further into his shell. But then, to his surprise, Alaric reached out and cupped Edward's face in his clawed hand, his touch gentle despite its roughness. "You're a fool," Alaric said softly, his voice tinged with something unrecognizable. "But perhaps that's what I need, a fool willing to believe in me when I can't." Edward smiled, his chest swelling with warmth. "Then let me be that fool." Their quiet moment was interrupted by a sudden chill that swept through the room. The candles flickered violently, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, more menacing. Alaric's expression hardened, his hand dropping from Edward's face as he turned to face the encroaching darkness. "The curse is restless," he said, his voice low. "It won't let me have this." Edward stepped closer, his hand brushing against Alaric's arm. "Then we'll fight it. Together." Alaric looked at him, a flicker of hope and fear in his eyes. "You don't know what you're saying, Edward." This curse is relentless. It will stop at nothing to destroy me, and anyone who stands with me. Let it try, Edward replied, his voice steady. I won't abandon you, Alaric. No matter what. The shadows hissed, their malevolent whispers filling the room. But Edward stood firm, his resolve unshaken. And for the first time in centuries, Alaric felt something he thought he had lost forever, a glimpse of hope, fragile but bright. The night air was thick with tension, a quiet but oppressive weight that pressed against the walls of the drawing room. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows, dancing like spectres across the room. Edward and Alaric stood in the heart of the chaos, a silent understanding between them as the dark presence seemed to pulse, growing stronger by the moment. It's not just the curse, Alaric murmured, his voice a low growl. It's something more. Something ancient. His golden eyes narrowed, focused on the shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. Edward felt the air grow colder, a deep, gnawing chill that sank into his bones. The shadows closed in around them, their whispers growing louder, filled with malicious intent. Alaric. Edward's voice trembled slightly, but he didn't step back. He reached for Alaric's hand, his grip firm despite the fear crawling up his spine. We'll face this together. You're not alone. Alaric's gaze flickered to Edward, something unreadable passing through his eyes. His hand, once clenched into a fist, slowly uncurled, and he took a tentative step forward. You don't understand, Edward. This curse was not only placed on me, it's a part of me. It's as much a part of my soul as the blood that courses through my veins. It will never leave. Edward stepped closer, his heart pounding. Then let's change that. Together. You don't have to carry this alone, not anymore. The beast's features softened for a brief moment, his golden eyes flashing with something vulnerable, something tender. But before Alaric could respond, the darkness surged forward, its sinister whispers drowning out the moment. You can't escape what you are, Alaric, the shadows hissed. You are the beast. You are the curse. And so long as you breathe, this darkness will follow. The words struck Alaric like a physical blow, his posture stiffening, his face contorting with the weight of the centuries of torment. But Edward's grip on his hand tightened, grounding him. No, Edward said, his voice steady and resolute. You are not just the curse. You are not just the monster they say you are. You are Alaric, the man who saved me from despair, the man who danced with me in the moonlight. The man who still has a heart. Alaric's breath hitched, his golden eyes locking onto Edward's, raw emotion flickering behind them. The shadows seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though unsure how to react to the defiance radiating from Edward. I can't do this, Alaric whispered, his voice thick with pain. I don't know how to be anything other than this monster. Edward's heart ached at the words, but he refused to let the darkness take hold of Alaric again. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be anything other than who you are right now. The past is behind us. We'll carve a future that's ours, together. Alaric closed his eyes, as though the weight of Edward's words was too much to bear. But when he opened them again, the shadows in the room seemed to shrink back, no longer as threatening. You're truly willing to fight this with me? Alaric asked, his voice hoarse, unsure. Edward nodded, his expression unwavering. Yes. Whatever it takes. You're not alone, Alaric. For a moment, Alaric stood still, as if waiting for the curse to strike back, for the shadows to consume them both. But then, with a deep breath, he seemed to exhale the darkness within him. His shoulders sagged slightly, the tension easing from his frame. I don't know if I deserve this, Alaric said, the words more of a whisper than anything else. Edward reached up, gently cupping his face, his touch light but steady. You do. You always have. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alaric allowed himself to believe it. He leaned into Edward's touch, the shadows receding like a storm finally passing. The following days were quieter, but no less intense. Edward and Alaric spent hours together, working to understand the curse and the darkness that had held Alaric captive for so long. Alaric's resistance was still palpable, but with each passing moment, Edward's presence seemed to soothe the beast's inner turmoil. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the library, Alaric spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid of what will happen when this curse fully releases its grip on me," he confessed, his eyes staring into the flickering flames. "What if I become something worse?" Edward was silent for a moment, considering the weight of Alaric's fears. "What if you don't? What if, when the curse is broken, you become who you were meant to be all along?" Alaric turned his head slowly to face him. "Who was that, Edward?" "A man," Edward replied simply, his voice soft yet filled with conviction. "A man who deserves love. A man who deserves peace. A man who deserves to be happy." Alaric's golden eyes searched Edward's face, and for the briefest moment, something like hope flickered behind them. He looked away quickly, as if afraid of what he might see in Edward's eyes, but Edward's gaze didn't waver. "You think I can still find peace?" Alaric asked quietly. "I know you can," Edward replied, his voice firm. "And I'll be here with you every step of the way." Alaric didn't respond at first, but after a long pause, he leaned closer, his breath warm against Edward's skin. "Thank you." Edward's heart skipped a beat at the closeness, the raw emotion in Alaric's voice. He reached up and gently cupped Alaric's face, his thumb brushing against the scar that marred his cheek. "I meant every word," Edward said softly, his gaze holding Alaric's. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in years, Alaric believed him. The next morning, something had shifted. The darkness that had once plagued the mansion seemed to recede, leaving in its wake a tentative but growing sense of peace. Alaric was no longer the creature of the curse, the beast that haunted the shadows. He was more than that. And as Edward looked at him, standing there with a quiet strength that had always been there, Edward realized that the man before him was no longer just a tortured soul. He was Alaric, a man who had fought through the storm and emerged with a chance at redemption. Together, they would face whatever came next. The days that followed were quiet, but in the silence, something profound grew between Edward and Alaric. It wasn't just a shared understanding anymore, it was something deeper, a connection that neither of them had anticipated but both were now unwilling to deny. The mansion, too, seemed to change. The once gloomy halls, heavy with the weight of Alaric's curse, were now alive with light. Edward's presence had done something to the house, perhaps it was the warmth he brought, or maybe it was the subtle shift in Alaric himself. The air seemed fresher, the rooms brighter, as though the very stones were breathing a sigh of relief. Edward, for his part, had grown more comfortable in the mansion's expansive, yet lonely spaces. He no longer flinched at the creaking of the floors or the long, echoing corridors. He knew the mansion now, its secrets, its creaks, and its hidden rooms, and most importantly, he had come to know Alaric. One morning, Edward was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. He'd taken it upon himself to ensure Alaric ate properly, knowing that the beast had spent too many years trapped in a cycle of guilt and self-inflicted punishment. Alaric, though often reluctant, had started to join him at the table, and over time, the meals became something they shared, not out of obligation, but out of choice. As Edward placed the plates on the table, he turned to find Alaric standing in the doorway, his posture more relaxed than it had been in weeks. The golden-eyed man leaned against the frame, watching him with an intensity that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. "Something on your mind?" Edward asked, offering him a small smile. Alaric didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped into the room, his heavy footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. He took his seat at the table, but his eyes never left Edward. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly, his voice low but clear. Edward tilted his head, surprised. "Thank me? For what?" "For not giving up on me," Alaric replied, his gaze finally softening as he looked at Edward. "For not seeing me as just the monster everyone else does." Edward sat down opposite him, his heart swelling at the sincerity in Alaric's words. "There's nothing to thank me for. I see you, Alaric. The man you are now, and the man you've always been beneath the curse." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Alaric's eyes glinted in the soft light of the morning sun, the golden hue brighter than ever. "You're a fool, you know," Alaric said, his voice gentle but laced with an affection that Edward had never heard before. You could have walked away, left this place behind, and yet you stay. Edward shrugged, his gaze meeting Alaric's. I'm not going anywhere. Alaric's expression faltered, something raw and vulnerable flashing in his eyes. He looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his plate absently. The room was filled with a quiet tension that Edward couldn't ignore, the air thick with unspoken words. I don't know what I feel anymore, Alaric confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. For so long, I was consumed by anger, by the curse, by everything that went wrong. But you've changed something in me. And I don't know what to do with it. Edward's heart pounded in his chest as he took in Alaric's words, his mind racing. Could it be possible? Could this be the moment they both feared and longed for? You don't have to know everything right now, Edward said softly, reaching across the table to gently take Alaric's hand in his. I'm here. We'll figure it out together. Alaric's eyes softened as he looked at Edward's hand resting in his, the warmth of it both surprising and comforting. The years of loneliness, the isolation he had endured, seemed to melt away with Edward's touch. I never thought I'd have this, Alaric murmured, his thumb grazing the back of Edward's hand. Not after everything I've done. But you make me believe it's possible. Edward's pulse quickened, and he dared to look up at Alaric, his breath catching in his throat. There was something in Alaric's eyes, something that mirrored the hope and longing he had buried deep within himself. You deserve happiness, Edward said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. And you're not alone in this. I promise. For a long moment, they simply sat there, hands intertwined, the weight of the world outside the walls of the mansion forgotten. In that shared silence, the connection between them deepened, the bond that had started as a flicker now burning brightly. That evening, Alaric took Edward outside for a walk in the garden, a place Edward had come to cherish for the life and color it brought to the once-dying mansion. The night was cool, and the stars hung low in the sky, casting their soft glow over the carefully tended plants. The scent of flowers filled the air, a stark contrast to the dark history of the place. They walked side by side, their steps in sync, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant crooning of night creatures. Alaric's presence beside Edward felt natural now, as if the years of solitude had never been, as if this was always how it was meant to be. I don't know how to be this person, Alaric admitted after a long silence. How to be someone worthy of your trust, your affection. Edward stopped walking, turning to face Alaric. He placed a hand on Alaric's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his fingertips. You're already worthy, Alaric. You always were. Don't let your past define who you are now. You've changed. You're changing. Alaric looked down at Edward's hand, his expression conflicted, unsure. I don't know what the future holds. I don't even know if I deserve it. Edward smiled softly, stepping closer, his hand sliding to Alaric's face, brushing gently against the cool skin. You do. And whatever the future holds, we'll face it together. Alaric's golden eyes flickered with uncertainty before softening, the walls he had so carefully built around himself beginning to crumble. Slowly, he leaned down, his breath warm against Edward's lips. You make me want to believe it, he whispered. Edward's breath caught in his throat, his heart racing as Alaric's lips brushed against his. The kiss was tentative at first, unsure, but as their lips met again, it deepened, full of the quiet promise they had both been afraid to make. In that moment, everything else faded away, the mansion, the curse, the pain of the past, until only the two of them remained, bound together by something more powerful than either of them had ever known. The days after their kiss were filled with an undeniable shift. The mansion, once a place of gloom and despair, now carried the subtle warmth of newfound hope. It wasn't an instantaneous change, after all, nothing in their lives had ever been easy, but it was a change nonetheless. Alaric was no longer just the brooding, tortured man of the past. With each passing day, he was evolving, shedding the weight of his curse bit by bit, and Edward was there, a constant presence at his side, offering patience and understanding. But even in the midst of this transformation, something lingered. A quiet tension still hung in the air, unspoken and persistent, as if both of them were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. One morning, Edward woke early to find Alaric standing by the window, gazing out at the garden. The light of dawn filtered through the glass, casting Alaric's silhouette in a soft glow. There was something almost ethereal about him in that moment, his golden eyes reflecting the quiet beauty of the world outside, his expression unreadable. "Alaric?" Edward's voice was soft, the question hanging in the air. Alaric turned, his gaze locking onto Edward's with a quiet intensity. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low and contemplative. "I don't know how to move forward. I don't know what's real anymore." Edward stepped forward, his bare feet silent on the stone floor. "What do you mean?" "The curse," Alaric murmured, his eyes never leaving Edward's. "It's always been a part of me. I don't know who I am without it." Edward's heart ached at the words, but he approached Alaric slowly, as though walking on fragile ground. "You're not the curse, Alaric," he said gently, his voice full of quiet conviction. "You're more than that." Alaric's golden eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he didn't pull away. "How do you know? How do you know I'm more than the monster I've been for centuries?" Edward reached out, his hand brushing gently against Alaric's arm. "Because I see you, Alaric. Not the curse, not the beast, just you. The man standing before me." Alaric's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a longing, a vulnerability that had been buried for so long. "Why?" Alaric's voice was barely a whisper. "Why would you see me like that? After everything I've done?" Edward's hand moved to Alaric's cheek, his thumb gently caressing the scar that marred his face. "Because I believe in you. I believe in who you are now, not in the past that haunts you." The room fell into a heavy silence as Alaric's gaze softened. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to fully feel the weight of Edward's words. And in that moment, it was as though the years of pain, the weight of the curse, the isolation, all of it began to unravel. Slowly, Alaric leaned into Edward's touch, his body trembling ever so slightly. "I don't know if I can be the man you want me to be," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can be anything other than the monster I've always been." Edward smiled softly, his fingers brushing through Alaric's hair. "You're already more than that," he whispered. "You're already so much more than you realize." The days that followed were filled with small moments of change. Alaric began to let go of the past, little by little. He took longer walks through the garden, spent more time in the study, and even began to join Edward for dinner without the same distance between them that had once existed. There was a sense of openness now, a willingness to trust and to heal that hadn't been there before. Yet, even with the progress, there was still something haunting about the mansion. It was as though the very foundation of the house was tied to Alaric's curse. No matter how much light Edward brought into Alaric's life, the mansion's walls still whispered of darkness. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the library, Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. The shadows seemed to move unnaturally, as though they were aware of the changes taking place within the mansion. Alaric, too, seemed to notice, his gaze flickering to the corners of the room as if something were watching them. "What is it?" Edward asked quietly, his voice tinged with concern. Alaric's face tightened, his expression suddenly serious. "The curse is not easily undone," he murmured. "Even now, there are forces at play that we cannot control." Edward stood up, moving to Alaric's side. "What do you mean?" "The curse," Alaric continued, "wasn't just a random affliction. It was placed here, in this house, for a reason. And as much as we've fought to break free from it, there are still powers that linger in these walls. Forces that will not let go so easily." Edward's chest tightened at the words. "Then we'll fight them together." Alaric turned to him, his golden eyes full of a fierce intensity. "We will. But we must be prepared. The darkness we face is not just within me, it's in this place. And if we're not careful, it will consume us both." Edward nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll fight it. Together." The next morning, they ventured into the hidden corridors of the mansion, places they had yet to explore. As they descended into the bowels of the house, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. At the end of the corridor, they found a door, old and worn, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was a door neither of them had noticed before. Alaric hesitated for a moment before reaching out and turning the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. As they stepped inside, a chill swept through the air, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, alive with malevolent energy. Edward's heart raced, but he stood firm, his hand brushing against Alaric's as they moved further into the room. "I've never been here," Alaric whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. "This room, it wasn't here before." A low, growling voice echoed through the chamber, causing both of them to freeze in place. "You cannot escape your fate, Alaric," the voice hissed. "You are mine, and you will always be mine." The shadows seemed to gather, forming into a dark figure that towered above them. It was a creature of nightmares, its form ever-shifting, a mass of darkness and twisted limbs. "You have no place here, Edward," the voice continued. "Alaric is mine. And he will never be free." The air in the darkened room grew heavier, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was being twisted by the malevolent presence that surrounded them. Alaric stood frozen, his body tense, eyes locked on the dark figure that loomed before them. Edward, though his heart raced, took a step closer to Alaric, his hand once again brushing against the other man's. "Alaric," Edward said softly, his voice steady despite the overwhelming weight of fear pressing down on them. "We've come this far together. We'll face this, too." Alaric's golden eyes flickered toward him, filled with both fear and something else, something like hope, or perhaps a final shred of defiance. But it was clear that even he, with all his strength, was shaken by the figure that had appeared in the darkness. "You cannot save him, Edward," the figure growled, its voice like the rumbling of distant thunder. "This is his destiny. He is bound to me, body and soul. There is no escaping it." Edward swallowed hard, but he refused to back down. "We'll see about that." The figure shifted, twisting its form until it took on a more familiar shape, one that was almost human, but distorted and monstrous, with shadowy tendrils writhing from its body. It was the very embodiment of Alaric's curse, the force that had trapped him in this mansion for centuries. "You think you can break the curse," the figure laughed, the sound deep and malevolent. "You are nothing but a mortal, a fleeting thing. And yet you dare to challenge me? You know nothing of the power you face." Edward stepped forward, his eyes locking with the creature's glowing red ones. "I may not know everything, but I know Alaric. And I know that he is not what you say he is." Alaric's expression faltered, torn between the power of the curse that had ruled his life and the truth that Edward had shown him. For the first time, he didn't feel entirely bound by the darkness. For the first time, he felt that there might be a way out, a way to be free. "You've been lying to him for so long," Edward continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Alaric is not your prisoner. He's a man, a soul, and he deserves to live his life without this curse hanging over him. You don't control him anymore." The creature's form rippled with rage, its tendrils snapping and writhing in the air like serpents. "Foolish mortal," it hissed. "You think love can break a curse? You think you can change fate with nothing but your will? You are nothing compared to me." Edward's hand tightened around Alaric's, his resolve hardening. "I don't care how powerful you are. We're not giving up. We'll fight this together. Alaric deserves to be free, and I'll make sure he is." The figure's eyes narrowed in fury, and for a moment, the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around them. But Alaric, his heart beating fiercely in his chest, stepped forward, his gaze unyielding. "Edward is right," Alaric said, his voice quiet but filled with an intensity that matched the storm in the room. "I've been bound by you for too long. But I'm not your puppet anymore. I won't let you control me." The creature snarled, its form shifting again, the darkness growing thicker around them. It reached out with a tendril, aiming to strike Alaric down, but Edward acted without thinking, pulling Alaric to the side just in time. The tendril struck the stone floor with a sickening crack, splintering the surface in an explosion of dust and debris. "Together, Alaric," Edward urged, his eyes locked onto the dark entity. "We can defeat this. We have to believe it." Alaric nodded, his breath quickening as he stepped closer to Edward, their bodies now side by side. The bond between them, forged in trust and shared purpose, was their greatest weapon. Alaric could feel it, a warmth spreading through him, pushing against the cold darkness that had defined his existence for so long. With a deep breath, Alaric closed his eyes and reached out, drawing on the power that had been lying dormant within him, the part of himself that had been buried by centuries of fear and guilt. The curse had always been a part of him, yes, but it was not who he was. Not anymore. "I am not your slave," Alaric spoke aloud, his voice steady and firm. "I am my own man." The darkness recoiled, the figure faltering for a moment as though it were being repelled by Alaric's words. The tendrils of shadow shrieked in pain, twisting and snapping like broken strings. But the figure would not yield so easily. With a snarl, it lunged toward them again, a mass of darkness crashing toward them like a tidal wave. But this time, Edward was ready. As the creature descended, Edward drew a silver dagger from his belt, a gift from the mansion's former owner, one that had been kept hidden for centuries. The blade glowed faintly in the dim light, its silver sheen reflecting the terror and determination in his eyes. With a swift motion, Edward thrust the dagger into the heart of the darkness. The creature howled, its form disintegrating in an explosion of black smoke and twisted shadows. The room shook violently, but Edward and Alaric stood firm, their hands still clasped tightly together. For a moment, everything was still. The darkness had receded, and the room, once heavy with malevolent energy, was now silent. The air felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Alaric turned to Edward, his golden eyes wide with disbelief. You did it." Edward's chest rose and fell with labored breaths, but he smiled softly. "No, we did it. Together." Alaric's gaze softened, a deep, overwhelming emotion rising within him. The curse had not been fully broken, but for the first time, it felt like the chains that had bound him for centuries had loosened. The power of the curse still lingered, but it was no longer an invincible force. And in that moment, Alaric realized something: no matter what darkness remained, he had Edward now. And with that, he had the strength to face whatever came next. The mansion, once a prison, now felt like a home. The next few days were filled with quiet moments of reflection. Alaric, though still burdened by his past, was beginning to see the world in a new light. Edward, always by his side, was the constant that kept him grounded. The bond between them had deepened, and though they both knew the journey ahead would be difficult, they faced it together. For the first time in Alaric's life, he felt like he wasn't alone. And that made all the difference. The days following their victory over the creature were both calm and unsettling. The mansion, once filled with the oppressive energy of the curse, now seemed almost lighter. It wasn't perfect, of course. Alaric could still feel the remnants of darkness lurking in the corners of his mind, as if the fight they had just won was only a fraction of the battle. The curse had been a part of him for so long, and though they had struck a blow against it, its echoes still resonated within him. But there was something new now. Something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for centuries: hope. Alaric found himself wandering the mansion at night more often, gazing at the old walls that had borne witness to his torment. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees outside, a sound that seemed to whisper of change, of freedom. But even as his thoughts drifted to the future, there was a gnawing question in the back of his mind. What would happen next? The curse hadn't been fully broken. They hadn't defeated the true source of it yet. The dark figure they had faced was only a manifestation, a twisted extension of the curse that had bound him. There were deeper, darker forces at play, ones that neither of them fully understood. But Alaric wasn't about to let that stop him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden, Edward approached him as he stood by the window, looking out at the fading light. His presence, warm and steady, was like a silent reassurance that Alaric wasn't alone. "You've been quiet lately," Edward said softly, standing beside him, his hand brushing gently against Alaric's. "What's on your mind?" Alaric turned to look at him, his expression guarded but soft. "I'm just thinking," he said, his voice low. "About what comes next. I feel like we've only scratched the surface. The curse isn't fully gone. And I know it's not just this place that's haunted me. It's me, too. I still carry it." Edward met his gaze, his eyes full of understanding and something deeper, something that, over time, had become unmistakably tender. "We'll figure it out together," Edward said, his voice unwavering. "Whatever comes, we'll face it as we have before." Side by side. Alaric's chest tightened at the sincerity in Edward's words. He had spent so long believing that he was beyond redemption, that no one could ever truly understand him or accept him. But Edward had seen him. Seen him in a way no one else ever had. "I don't deserve this," Alaric whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, you do," Edward replied instantly, his hand tightening around Alaric's. "You deserve peace. You deserve love. You deserve a future without this curse hanging over you." The warmth of Edward's touch settled deep within Alaric's chest, filling the void that had been there for centuries. But even as the bond between them deepened, Alaric could not shake the fear that had begun to creep into his heart. It was a fear that had always existed, lurking in the shadows of his soul, the fear that, no matter what they did, the curse would one day return to claim him, and that it would tear them apart. "Edward," Alaric began, his voice heavy with the weight of the thoughts he could no longer keep to himself. "I'm scared. Scared that the curse will come back. Scared that I'll lose you, that I'm not enough to keep it away." Edward stepped closer, his hand gently cupping Alaric's face, tilting his head to meet his gaze. "You are more than enough, Alaric. You've always been. And I'm not going anywhere. We'll face whatever comes together." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the words hanging between them. Then, slowly, Alaric leaned into Edward's touch, his eyes closing as he allowed himself to simply feel. Days passed, and the quiet life they had begun to build together felt fragile, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Alaric found himself more and more drawn to the ancient books in the mansion's library, seeking answers, seeking a way to fully rid himself of the curse. He pored over texts that had been locked away for centuries, some written in languages he had never seen before, some filled with cryptic symbols that seemed to hold the key to his freedom. One evening, as he sat by the fire, a book open in front of him, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. He didn't need to look up to know it was Edward. The soft rhythm of his movements had become a comfort, a constant that Alaric relied on. "Anything useful?" Edward asked, his voice breaking the silence. Alaric shook his head. "I don't know. Some of these texts speak of powerful rituals, ways to break curses, ways to free souls trapped by dark magic. But they're incomplete. Fragments, really." Edward's brow furrowed slightly as he stepped closer. "What do you mean? Fragments?" Alaric turned the page, revealing a faded manuscript that seemed to shimmer in the firelight. "These rituals, they need a specific kind of power to work. A balance of dark and light magic. But the texts are unclear. They don't tell me what that balance is. It's like they are hiding something." Edward studied the page for a moment, then met Alaric's gaze. "So, you're saying we don't have everything we need yet?" "I'm saying we don't know what we need," Alaric replied, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'm missing something, and I don't know what it is." Edward remained silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then, with quiet determination, he placed a hand on Alaric's shoulder. "We'll find it," Edward said. "Whatever it takes. We'll find the missing piece." Alaric met his gaze, the weight of their situation settling over him once more. But there was a glimmer of hope in Edward's eyes, a certainty that Alaric hadn't felt in a long time. Together, they would uncover whatever was hidden in the shadows, whatever piece of the puzzle had eluded them. And they would face whatever darkness remained, together. But as they spoke, they didn't realize that the shadows in the mansion were stirring once more. A presence, one far older and far more dangerous than anything they had faced before, was watching them. Waiting. The true source of the curse had not yet shown its face.